Welcome back. There is a live look outside from the Oregon coast, our Init Spanish Head Resort Hotel camera in Lincoln City. Thanks for watching Afternoon Live. Adoption is often a beautiful gift that brings a child into a loving home, but even when the circumstances are positive, the adoptee can still suffer from ongoing trauma. Our next guest writes about this in her new book, Abandoned at Birth, Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me. We welcome Janet Sherlund. Thank you so much for joining us, Janet.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you're very vulnerable telling your story in this book. Tell us a bit about your adoption story and what you've learned about how you came into this world.
Well, I was given up at birth and adopted under a closed adoption 5 weeks later. And the closed adoption that was very common in the 50s, 60s, and 70s meant that there wasn't any information whatsoever about my origins, my authentic identity, my ethnic background, the circumstances of my adoption. There was literally nothing. My adoptive parents' names were put on my birth certificate, the only birth certificate I ever saw, and I was raised with the identity that they gave me. Their heritage and their name, and growing up, I always felt other. I had a perfectly fine adoption. I had a loving home. But the biggest things I've learned through my search is that love is not enough, sadly. And the cultural narrative is that love is enough. All a child needs is a loving family, loving parents, and that they'll be fine. But that's not true, especially in adoption. Those of us that are adopted have something called genealogical bewilderment. And what that means, especially for those of us adopted under closed adoptions, is that without any concept of who we are, what our heritage is, where we came from, without ever seeing someone who looks like us or acts like us or shares the same sense of humor, it's almost impossible to develop in a healthy, integrated way when you don't have your kin around that mirrors you, and you hear the history of your family and your clan. And thus, adoptees have 4 times the suicide rate of the regular population and are overrepresented in hospitalizations for both addiction and mental health. It's difficult to explain to people who grow up in a biological family how important the knowledge that they just take for granted is about themselves, and what trauma it is to individuals who don't have that information, feel like they are not tethered to this world, that there's a big black hole inside them, that they just don't know where they came from, and they don't know why they were given up, and they have that feeling of grief and loss and rejection for what they can only imagine is what must be like to feel whole. And so I wrote my book to try and really express those feelings, to, number one, to affirm to other adoptees our experience, but also to let other people know that, if you're going to understand anyone you know who's adopted, or your family, if you're going to understand issues that we still grapple with these days, such as the struggles of donor-conceived individuals or children in foster care or even reproductive rights, you need to understand the experience of the person raised in a borrowed family, and not simply hear the narrative of the adoptive parents or the birth parents, which is more normal for people to understand.
It makes a lot of sense, and you described some feelings you were grappling with as a young child, particularly around middle school, when you probably weren't even able to name your feelings, and the parents who adopted you, they didn't really have the resources or understanding to help you cope with that either.
Yeah, it hasn't been widely talked about or understood, because again, everyone said just love is enough, but it's not. You have to develop a sense of self. We all do that. We all struggle through life with our identity and a sense of self. But when you're within your biological family, you have things, you have knowledge about, your people, where you come from. You have things to push against, or things to welcome and embrace. And when you know nothing about yourself, I say to people, think about your life if you've never seen your mother's face. And if you'd never seen anybody who you felt at home with or at peace with, if you just felt like you were the only person in the world who was like yourself, and it's very difficult to form a sense of self and to become a healthy, intact person. You need that. And it goes sort of against the grain of the sort of the hallmark story we've been given about adoption, but it's so true. And I knew nothing about myself until I was in my 50s, and then was able to meet my biological, both first father and then mother. And the physicalness that I just can't describe that. The first parent I met was my birth father. And the moment I met him, I knew nothing, almost nothing about him. I couldn't have answered two questions about him. But the moment I looked into his eyes, I finally made sense for the first time in my life. That big black hole was just filled up. There was just this like almost physical feeling of completion, and I felt found and like I was with my clan for the first time in my life. It was almost like my cells recognized their blood, their kin. It was the most phenomenal feeling of the physical experience of meeting blood and finally making sense, looking into his eyes. And again, I knew nothing about him, but it was like coming home. And I had the same experience years later when I met my birth mother, even though she did not want to meet me and it wasn't a happy experience. Despite that, and despite her emotional rejection of me, my understanding of myself, my seeing myself in her, and the movements and the mannerisms, behaviors, the interests, uh, gave me so much knowledge about myself and really helped me to understand who I was, even though it wasn't a happy reunion.
It's remarkable the way that you describe it all, and thank you so much for sharing a bit of your story with us. I think your book will help a lot of people. Thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll have more about the book here, Abandoned at Birth, on our website at katu.com. We'll be right back with more Afternoon Live right after this.